us on Twitter at Sankara Hours. This is Adam Hudson. Follow me on Twitter at Adam Hudson 5.
And this is Peter MGunn. Follow me at MGunn Peter, MGUNN Peter, saying it like I'm talking to customer service. I had to restart from 2 followers, but don't let the join date fool you. I've been on Twitter since like 2013 when it was actually cool. So, been on these streets and I've seen a lot of you people that are thinking about saying anything at us. I know what you people are about. Just got to preempt the haters, you know. But how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. I'm drinking. I'm drinking this new Belgium Hemperor. It says on the label it's 100% employee owned. This is New Belgium, 100%
Yeah.
employee owned.
Yeah.
Socialism right there.
Well,
That's socialism.
sort of. I think
Yeah.
New Belgium's an ESOP, and employee stock ownership program, which is not the same as
Oh.
a worker owned co-op. We should get into that because I feel
Yeah, we
like co-ops are like a really big thing and a really important thing going forward in the future. And making sure people understand the difference is big because basically like a worker owned co-op is like every worker gets one vote on the board.
Yeah, yeah.
um, and an ESOP is basically just like they let the employees buy stock options, you know, like all the
Okay. So it's
you
so
know
it's not like worker controlled.
yeah, I mean on this, not directly. It's like there's
Right.
still a board and employees are shareholders on it. But New
Okay.
Belgium, but it's better than other stuff. New
Yeah.
Belgium's pretty good, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Anchor's
So I'm just yeah.
Anchor's team just
Go-
got unionized, I believe. So
Right. Yeah, they did. They got unionized. So shout out to all of the hardworking brewers and people working in the beer industry and fighting hard for
yeah,
labor rights.
yeah. While we're on the topic of shout outs, I wanted to make sure I got in. Shout out to the Wet'suwet'en people in occupied what they call British Columbia. I don't who are preventing Trudeau and his oil cronies from they're resisting Trudeau and his oil cronies trying to build a pipeline through their lands. And I think today they got they got a pause. They announced that the construction will be paused for 2 days as they hereditary chiefs will be meeting with provincial and federal ministers. This is a really important thing to be up on. So, yeah,
Yeah.
solidarity to them.
Yeah, we are a Pan African Marxist podcast, but we still also stand in solidarity with other um, colonized people throughout the world.
Yes,
So
and believe in decolonization, which
yeah,
we will hopefully at some. I mean, we will at some point explain sort of what that actually can look like because it's kind of a thing people freak out a little bit about, but. Um,
yeah, yeah, and I also think like it'd be good to get into it because I think it's easy, like a lot of radical concepts. It's easy for people to use it as just like a slogan rather than like they're
yes.
something with a real political concept with actual material meat on the bones. Um, so this episode, we're going to be talking about a couple things. Toward the latter half of the episode, around there, we'll be talking about Thomas Sankara.
The man, the myth, the legend.
Yep, who our podcast is named after. Known as Africa's Che Guevara, he was um, the former he was a revolutionary from Burkina Faso, and he was a president of Burkina Faso throughout the mid '80s, and he was a very important Marxist and Pan African figure, and a very important figure in global Black liberation. I think there's some takeaways from from his legacy that are applicable today. But the first half, what we're going to dive into is obviously the 2020 presidential
Oh
election
shit.
in the United States. The ongoing fuckery and
Democracy facade spectacle.
yeah, hashed democracy TM, as I like to think of it. Uh,
Yeah.
so Peter's going to kick us off by talking about the
Um,
South Carolina
yeah.
primary, and I'm going to be talking about the this really explosive New York Times piece about the super delegates and Democratic Party officials and how they're basically just like be, just saying fuck Sanders. So yeah,
Yeah.
Peter, why don't you take it away with
Okay.
South Carolina?
Yes. We're recording this on Thursday night. So the primary is in 2 days. And supposedly, right now, they say Joe Biden has a commanding lead. Um, in a state whose Democratic Party is mostly black, Joe Biden, he just loves black people. We just love Joe Biden. It's just one of
Oh
those
yeah,
things, right? Even though
every black person has
is
like a statue of Joe Biden in our homes. We
he,
all do.
us
Yeah,
colored folks, we just love Joe Biden, even if he's lying about being arrested in South Africa, which is
and we
just
all know who Corn Pop is. Okay, we all know a guy named
corn
Corn
pops
Pop.
everyone's cousin.
Yep, exactly.
Because we're all
Next
related.
to Pookie and Ray Ray, and
And T-Bone,
yeah, T Bone as
up
well.
in Newark.
Yeah, yeah.
But I find South Carolina to be interesting because, you know, especially in 2016, this was sort of the big thing, was that like, um, okay, yeah, Bernie's doing well, and yeah, I mean, if we had the same measurements we have now back then, he probably would have won Iowa, and he won New Hampshire, right? But once he gets to the South, right, like Hillary Clinton's just got that sewed up, right? He's,
Yep.
and it and I remember when I was still on Twitter, and and in other situations, like older black people, um, just being like, what the hell is going on? I mean, like, why do you like, I know that you are like generally in favor of the things Bernie Sanders is asking for. Like, why don't you like Bernie Sanders? And you'd get the weirdest, responses from like, Bernie's not a Democrat to he sucks at being a legislator, though no sane person cares about a presidential candidate's effectiveness as a legislator. They just made that one up. Um,
Right. Yeah.
and you know, he's just a white guy from Vermont or whatever. These are people who I'm pretty sure like knew who Bernie Sanders was beforehand. But I guess this came to a head in South Carolina when he got like really wiped out. And I remember, and I probably should have looked this up. I should have done more research for this, but if I'm gonna like be reading books for this podcast, we gotta be making a little bit more money. um,
Subscribe, and you'll get also what we forgot to mention at the beginning is we have bonus content. We like to call it
yeah,
Real Sankara After Hours. So that's bonus only for patrons.
yeah. But there's some interesting things. But anyone who sort of like is a career Democrat understands that in a lot of states and cities, there's just like a machine politics where like, basically like these people have the power and they're bosses and they get to decide, and you basically have to kiss their ass for a few years. And then they will let you move up to higher offices. And, basically by doing that process, then you eventually get to like be in a position where you can run for like real shit like governor or senator or eventually president. And this is like So South Carolina is definitely like a very machine heavy state. And specifically, of course, right, Republicans like to talk about, oh, right, we're the party of Lincoln, right? But I mean, they are factually correct in the sense that, like, the Republican Party was created for Abraham Lincoln, basically. Um, and the Democratic Republican Party is what it was called back in like the
Yeah,
early part of the 1800s. You know, the Democratic Party in the 1860s, right, was the party of secessionists, of Civil War secessionists. And after the Civil War, right, there was Reconstruction where the Republican Party, there was a wing of it called the Radical Republicans, right, um, who were very ascendant, and they were doing a big hand in, sort of shaping Reconstruction. And Reconstruction is a thing that kind of gets glossed over. Like if you're in history class, they're like, "Oh, Reconstruction happened, and
yeah,
then it's stopped." But they don't really talk about what that was. And this is very important, specifically for the South Carolina Democratic Party. Um, Reconstruction was basically like, after, right, wars are very destructive. So, like, after a war is over, like, the entire land that the war was fought on is destroyed. And if you lose the war, then the winning army basically gets to, run shit. So, in the context of the US, right, then, like, the US army from the North basically was occupying the South, after the Civil War. And, you know, Southerners think this is bad, but the big part of that was that during this occupation, there was a whole, basically concerted movement to destroy the secessionist plantation, slave owning class that made up the holders of power in the South, and enfranchise black people. And I mean, provide reparations, provide equal rights. Even, black people were elected to public office in the 1870s, right?
yeah. Fun fact. My dad told me this. I remember when I was a kid, like years ago. But both sides of my family like to do family history stuff like that. And my dad pointed out that one of my ancestors was a former slave who was elected as I think he was a local politician in Texas right after it was during the period of Reconstruction. So yeah, during that period, it was a brief moment where like a lot of formerly enslaved Africans who were newly free after the Civil War because slavery was abolished. Black people were. It was easier for them to participate in political life. So you did see like, some black elected officials now as a way to essentially make up for centuries of
Yeah.
slavery.
Yeah. And I mean, South Carolina specifically um, was a majority black state. That, like, it was
Yeah,
that heavy.
and
Um,
also like to add some context, like I was looking at the population, like the 1790 census for like the 13 colonies at the time, and like I believe it was states like South Carolina, Virginia. A lot of those states were like at 1790, like a third of their population was black, like African. So by the 1800s, yeah, a state like Carolina, that population is going to grow. So this is like consider that like 1790, states like Virginia and like South Carolina and Georgia, like they had almost anywhere between a third to two-fourths of their population being like enslaved African, like anywhere between like 20 to 40% were like black people in those states were slaves.
yeah, yeah, it's nuts. South Carolina became majority white by 1920 because so many black people had left. So that should give you a sort of insight into this. But sort of the during Reconstruction in 1876, um, there was a gubernatorial election. And so obviously, right, so obviously, the slave owning class does not really appreciate having their power stripped away and their slaves being freed and all that shit. So they organize, which are, I mean, there's no mincing words about it, terrorist organizations
Yeah.
like the Klan. But in South
Hmm.
Carolina, there was another organization called the Red Shirts, and they were, I mean, I guess they're not terror. They were the Red Shirts were a little more than a terrorist organization. That they were like basically a straight up paramilitary. It was, and so for the 1876 gubernatorial election, the election for South Carolina governor's office, um, the Democratic Party basically had its own militia that like it mobilized to basically terrorize black people into not voting for the Republican and instead vote for the Democrat Wade Hampton III, who um, won by a narrow margin of slightly over 1,100 votes. Nice. Clutch.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, this is the political history of South Carolina, like military coups straight up. And people, I think a lot of times that history gets glossed over, and people don't understand exactly how violent sort of the revanchist project of the white planter class was. But it was, I mean, it was really fucking heavy. Um, and so, from 18, basically once the Democratic Party gets put back in power, at the end of Reconstruction, it basically has a stranglehold on the state's politics, like it did basically in every other part of the South, right? The Republican Party, you know, does not have a its brand's not doing so well in the South because it represents, you know, the North, the War of Northern aggression, all that shit. Um, and that is the Democratic Party. Through the 40s, through Strom Thurmond's party, right? And and it basically was that party until the 60s, right? Of course, but when like some people started defecting towards the Republicans over civil rights legislature and such. But Strom Thurmond was still a Democrat, or
Yeah.
I guess he eventually switched parties. But like the Democratic Party, even after the '60s, still there's I guess like political blueprints. I'm not saying it was a racist party at that point, but there's sort of like political mechanisms.
I
And
mean,
so,
there's, I think, yeah, because I think they still have that sort of good old Southern boy kind of culture in the Democratic Party, even after the
yeah,
60s. Yeah,
yeah,
like,
and
I think, yeah, like people like, I mean, Carter's pretty liberal, but I mean, he came from the South. Bill Clinton, I think, is a good example. Like, he
yeah.
was, in the 90s, he was, seen as like, oh, I like black people, I'm down with black folks, blah, blah, blah. But like, he was still kind of had that, he was like a good Southern boy. You know what I'm saying? So,
Yeah.
so yeah.
And South Carolina was still like a very, I mean, white rule was written into the Constitution until 1968. And another fun thing that happened in South Carolina in 1968 was the Orangeburg Massacre, 2 years before Kent State, mind you, um, where there was a protest over segregation at a bowling alley. Um, Bowling alley's still there, apparently, or at least the sign is.
Hmm.
Um, and 3 people were killed when police began firing live ammunition into the crowd. Of course, they claimed that they were being shot at, of course. Good. I find that stuff interesting in the sense that, like, when people talk about totalitarianism and authoritarianism, they don't understand that, like, white supremacy was a totalitarian system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, but I guess the main point I'm trying to get to, Rachel Maddow style, is they had to. as basically white people bolted for the a lot of those people bolted for the Republican Party. Um, they had to sort of encourage, or they had to cultivate like a sort of black deal making class. And I feel like this is an example because they still held on to state legislatures until 1993, which is kind of crazy. So like the party is completely changed supposedly, but they still sort of have like their political machines working. And so in the 1990s when they did redistricting, um, then state representative Don Beatty, they redistricted things to give black Democrats more gerrymandered seats in the House, but by creating more black majority seats, they also created more extremely white districts, which helped the Republicans take over the legislature. So I think like what that shows is that it's like a a small amount of black people got some semblance of power, but in the process of that small coterie being empowered, a white supremacist party ended up getting a lot more power, and the Democrats sort of, I mean, I guess they intentionally did this. I don't know, sort of, not an expert on congressional districting maps, but like there's definitely ways to draw districts that are, would promote a more left agenda. The other thing that is important to understand about South Carolina, right, is, and a lot of states where you're like, why are they so conservative or whatever, is the lack of union representation. In the Midwest
Mm-hmm.
or the East Coast or, California still also, right? Like unions are a big part of the Democratic Party. They're kind of the backbone of it, especially in like sort
Yep.
of the state and local functions. But this is not true in, unions are notoriously weak in the South. They, and especially this is one of the things that I believe. Yeah, South Carolina was right to work since 1954. And right to work, if you don't understand what that is, it's basically a law that says that, like, if you get hired at at a company that is represented by a union, you don't have to join that union. Even though that union is still representing you, you don't have to pay the union dues. And of course, this creates basically a sort of selfish incentive where you're just like, I mean, union dues are like $30 a month or something. Like, in any situation, like the amount of dues you would get, you would have to pay um, to unionize. And this is sort of a good like counter propaganda to anti-union shit. The amount of union dues you'd have to pay is always going to be a lot less than the amount more you would get from a collective bargaining agreement if you had a union. But you know, it's one of those master Republican laws. So yeah, since 1954, real OGs on this shit. Um, and the lack of unions basically is prevents like the you know unions are like the main instrument for driving progressive policy in America. And so in states where they're weak, then the Democratic Party is just always going to be more conservative because they don't have that power structure. And instead, they rely on the church basically, and
Yeah.
the church is just, I mean, I'm not going to make blanket statements because about every church, every black church, whatever. But it's always going to be like a more reactionary, conservative institution than labor unions. Sorry, that's the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think that's too controversial to say. But yeah. So we'll see with South Carolina. Like we said, we're recording this, Thursday night. And wait, what's the day of the South? It's Friday, right, or Saturday?
It's Saturday, 29th,
Okay.
leap day.
Yeah. So yeah. So that's going to be the South Carolina primary. This also dovetails into what I want to talk about, and so I guess Peter, you said that Biden's leading in South Carolina, right?
Yes,
Do you know how many?
the media is very much trying to make like the Biden comeback a thing. Um,
Okay,
I believe
we'll
that.
see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, my my general sense is like for the sort of career Democrat apparatchiks, they really don't want Bloomberg to be able to just take this shit over. But they also really don't
Right.
want Bernie to be able to win. So, the original plan of Biden, Obama, right? He just sent a cease and desist letter. And that is, I feel like that was one of those things where like he's very much like I'm not weighing in, but I'm sort of, but he's been doing these kind of moves
Yeah. Yeah.
subtly
Yeah.
to
Very
sort of
passive aggressive.
signal that he's kind of that he's still like in favor of Biden, but he's not going to come out and endorse him because they need the process. They have to rig it fair and square, right?
Yeah. Speaking of rigging, so there is this piece that came out in the New York Times today actually, and John Iadarola of the Young Turks described it as a bombshell New York Times piece, and I
Oh,
think that's a pretty
but
fair assessment.
by the way,
Yeah.
young Turks, recognize your fucking union, dude.
Yes. Yes.
Stop playing around.
Yeah. So Young Turks, yeah, recognize your union. Just want to say that. So shout out to the TYT union fighting hard for representation. Anyway, so this is a New York Times piece. The title of it is Democratic Leaders Willing to Risk Party Damage to Stop Bernie Sanders. And so like the sort of the sort of sub headlines basically. So they interviewed dozens of Democratic Party officials, including 93 superdelegates, and they found overwhelming opposition to handing Sanders a nomination if he fell short of a majority of delegates. So apparently, under the rules, in order to get the nomination, you have to get a majority of delegates. And now,
1991.
yeah, and also like consider the fact that there's like over half a dozen people running on the ballot. So like it's going to be hard for any candidate to get a majority of the delegates. And so
So,
this piece.
though, to be clear, Bernie is the only person who could possibly do it.
Exactly. Yeah. So the piece says, um, this is the third paragraph of it. Dozens of interviews with Democratic establishment leaders this week show that they are not just worried about Mr. Sanders' candidacy, but are also willing to risk intra-party damage to stop his
Mm.
nomination at the national convention in July if they get the chance. Since Mr. Sanders' victory in Nevada caucuses on Saturday, the Times has interviewed 93 party officials, all of them superdelegates who could have a say on the nominee at the convention, and found overwhelming opposition to handing the Vermont senator the nomination if he arrived with the most delegates but fell short of a majority. So basically, like, so we're going into South Carolina, right? So far, like Iowa has been like, there's been some fuckery going on, but I think it's fair to say that like Sanders pretty much got
He got the
one.
most votes.
He got the most votes, so he won. So Sanders got Iowa. He got Nevada. He got New Hampshire, and his support only seems to be growing and growing and growing. And our first episode of this podcast, we were talking about Occupy Wall Street and sort of first of all, the 2008 crash, right, financial crash, then Occupy Wall Street, and that kind of, I think, years long bubbling of economic populist rage that's kind of been going on in this country. And
Mm.
Sanders represents that. And so, what Peter was saying about how unions have always represented the Democratic base, well, since the 80s and the 90s, the Democratic Party has largely moved away from its base. And I want to make this clear before I go on about the Democratic Party. I really don't have like, I'm not super giddy about the two party system or super giddy about party loyalty to the Democratic Party. Like I'm not. I don't hold any particular allegiance or affection for either of the major parties. But it's fair to say that traditionally the Democratic Party, particularly since Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the whole New Deal, that the Democratic Party has always supposed to have represented unions, the working class, and since the civil rights era, not black people and people of color, right? That's always been like the Democrats. That's always been part of their coalition. That's the Democratic base, essentially a union, working class, downtrodden, non-white, um, and any kind of
and
other
university
marginalized.
professors.
Right. Yeah. So that's the Democratic Party coalition, and for the most part, the Democratic Party and the establishment has largely moved away from its base, the heart and soul of it. And it's really important, especially for political parties, because I think a lot of like I know someone who's like kind of a sort of a what you would call like a consultant, right? And I think there's a good deal of these like sort of party consultant people who like they truly believe in liberal institutions, party institutions, and preserving the unity and sanctity of those institutions. But a lot of times, and you see their commentaries a lot in like the New York Times and a lot of these like other liberal publications. But a lot of one thing that they tend to miss out in their analyses of the election and political institutions is that political parties really they get their legitimacy from their base. If the party does
Yeah,
not have a base that
a
it
mass
pays
base.
fealty to, a mass base that gives it legitimacy and it pays fealty to, that party is no longer legitimate. So, and that's
Wow.
when it comes to saving the Democratic Party. If that's the thing anyone if you care about, like saving the Democratic Party, the smartest thing to do would be to nominate Sanders because his base, contrary to the all the talk about Bernie Bros, the base of Bernie Sanders is largely people of color, women, and working class people. That's the Sanders base, and Sanders' base is the Democratic Party's base. That's their base, and so and I think since the '80s, a lot of the Democratic Party's bases felt like, you know what, this party's moving away from our interests,
Hmm.
our legitimate political aspirations, our economic interests. The party's moved away, and considering things are getting really, really bad in this country, especially economically, and with the climate crisis and these endless wars, the Democrats have to make a decision like, okay, are we truly going to represent the will of our base or not? And this is why Sanders has been winning these states, is because Sanders speaks to the heart and soul of the Democratic Party's base. And since
Yeah.
the '80s and '90s, the Democrats have largely been gone the neoliberal route. We're going to, they've been kowtowing to billionaires, Wall Street, corporate America. And so, and I think that this article in New York Times really shows that the party establishment does not give a fuck about its base because they're saying that even if Sanders hypothetically, not even hypothetically, it seems very, very like very, very likely he could win the nomination and get the most delegates, right, and get the
Yeah.
most votes. And
He
they're
could win
basically saying,
outright.
yeah, so they're basically saying, okay, even in the case where he does get the most votes, which is democracy, they're going to be like, no, we're going to find someone else who's going to have less votes than Sanders, and it's not going to be legitimized and voted by the people, the Democratic base. They're willing to do that in order to
Yeah.
undermine Sanders. And here's their reasoning, right? So their reasoning basically is they fear Sanders' impact on on the down ticket
It's
races.
such crap. It's such crap. This is
Yeah,
the okay. If I can go off, this is like their
go ahead.
last.
Yeah, yeah,
This is their one of their last arguments. And it's really like an insider argument, and it's
it is.
like for if you really care about the Democratic Party, Democratic Party's not just about electing people. It's about local races and all this shit. Um,
By the
how
way, the Democrats have lost a lot of local and
Yes,
state
yes,
races during
yes.
the Obama years,
First of all, Democrats have been eating state and local Democrats have been eating shit for 30 years, running under neoliberalism.
particularly under Obama.
Yeah,
Under Obama, they
yeah.
lost a lot of state and local elections. So, yeah,
Second of all, how the fuck is Pete Buttigieg or Mike Bloomberg or honestly even Elizabeth Warren gonna help you down ticket? Let's be real here. Third, half of these people deserve to lose because they're like healthcare CEOs. So,
right. Yeah.
who cares
And that,
about them? Like all
and
they
also,
ever do when they get elected is just hold up progressive legislation. So, like the future of the Democratic Party is social democracy, and
yeah.
the Justice Democrats and the Squad and all of that shit that, I mean, I won't say shit. I mean, these are like brave people, honestly. Um, all those people, they represent a social democratic agenda. And if you crush the Bernie Sanders movement in the convention on national television, you are not just crushing that. You're not just crushing Bernie Sanders. You are also destroying the future of the Democratic Party. Um,
Yeah, and also Chris Matthews. I want to pop up this quote from Chris Matthews, but as I look for it, so here's the thing: is like I think this is my sort of assessment is that like if the Democratic Party, the officials, the uh, if they are willing to essentially, you know, just basically say like, hey, fuck democracy, we're gonna pick someone else. Um, they're basically guarantee just saying the U.S. might as well say outright that it's a one party state, and also with the down ticket race impact. I mean, like Peter, I think that argument's bullshit because here's the thing: like what they should be doing is running better Democrats. So if the wind is blowing in a social democratic direction in the country and Sanders represents that, if the Democratic Party again, if they care about preserving the longevity of the Democratic Party, it would make sense like to say, okay, you know what, we're going to run more progressive candidates on the state and local level, rather than sort of sort of cut the Sanders movement, because again, the Sanders it's beyond Sanders. Like he represents again the base of the Democratic Party that has not been listened to, and these
yeah.
elites are scared, and they're at the point where like Chris Matthews on MSNBC, he kind of said the quiet part out loud, and I'm going to read it because, again, I think he's saying what a lot of these people are thinking, and it ties into this article. So he said this a couple days ago. He said, I'm wondering whether the Democratic moderates want Bernie Sanders to be president. Then he goes on, this may be too exciting a question to raise. They don't like Trump at all. Do they want Bernie Sanders to take over the Democratic Party in perpetuity? I mean, he takes it over. He sets the direction of the future of the party.
That's
Maybe they'd
true.
rather wait four. Maybe they'd rather wait 4 years and put in a Democrat that they like. So think about that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Basically,
No, these dem.
what they're saying is they would rather risk another 4 years of Trump than have Sanders in office. So remember, all the
Yeah,
past 4 years, it's been like Trump is an
all
evil
yeah.
monster.
The
He's
only thing that
stupid.
matters is beating
Blah blah
Donald
blah.
Trump, unless
We
it's
have
with
to beat
Bernie Sanders.
we have to beat Donald Trump. By the way, most of the Democrats voted for Trump's military budget,
Yeah,
$700 billion in military in military spending, right? So they voted also for NSA spying to grant him NSA
yeah.
spying powers. There's still the drone program that's going on under Trump. And by the way, there have
Expanded.
been more. It's been expanded. More civilians have been killed under Trump than under Bush and Obama. So Trump is continuing all that. The Democrats
Eh,
are largely on board with it. And right now, with Sanders as president, potentially as a nominee, they're saying Chris Matthews saying the quiet part out loud that they would rather have 4 years of Donald Trump so they can pick some sort of moderate centrist corporate Democrat that they like, rather than implement a social democratic party agenda. And this is clear, like this is something the left has been saying for years about like how the two
yeah,
parties are really the same. And at this point, they're just saying it out loud like they care more about preserving the democratic functionary class and the interests of corporate America, and they're more interested in that than implementing Medicare for all or a higher minimum wage or a
yeah,
Green New Deal. They would rather have preserve those Democratic Party officials and their power and their stranglehold on power and corporate America's interests and Wall Street's interests. They'd rather preserve that and risk another 4 years of Trump, who, again, they said the past 4 years, what have we been hearing from the Democrats? Oh, he's an existential threat to democracy. He's a Russian asset, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so you want another 4 years? They want another 4 years of that
Well,
versus social democracy.
here's the
They're
thing.
allowed now at this point.
Well, I mean, part of the thing is that like all the consultant class, like for them, these people who like all of this was, which was basically forged, from the 80s, the whole consultant class, like these people's like direct financial interest is not in Bernie Sanders. Like they will be out of a job because there will be no need for
Mm-hmm.
these people. Um,
Exactly.
and there will be if Bernie Sanders wins, like there will be a lot of people that will be out of the party. Um,
Yep.
a lot of detritus, and so you know they know that, but there are, I don't know. I mean, like a lot of people I grew up with, my like parents, friends, a lot of like average, just like the person who still has the Obama sticker on their bumper, still has the Obama sticker along with like five other bumper stickers. You know, you're like, you're just like your average Democratic faithful. Most of them don't really have a. They'll vote for Bernie Sanders. They don't have a problem with that. Um,
Yeah.
those people aren't the problem, but it really, it really remains to be seen if this is like the most energy like a working class movement has had, on the left in a very long time. And if the Democrats basically crush that, if, which I think I mean, it depends on the day. Sometimes I'm like very excited and bullish about it. And sometimes I'm like, I'm much more used to being miserable, so the misery and doom feels more comfortable, and I
I
don't
mean,
like to be right
yeah.
about this stuff. But if they do basically do that, then that New Deal coalition is dead. That in the
Yeah.
Democratic Party, and
And it will be a one party state at this point. You're just
unless
gonna basically what
unless
you're
we
gonna have.
unless we start building
Yeah.
a Labor Party, which I think is the
Right.
next step. But getting ahead of
Yeah.
ourselves. A lot of people still believe Bernie can win, and I think right now it is important to like try and put out positive energy, and kind of go out and kind of encourage, like, if any Warren people to help try and talk to them, and like, because like it's really, I mean, it's good, it's just social democracy, guys. I don't He's not a communist. I understand what people are
Right.
afraid of.
And also, like, I mean, like, yeah, Sanders, like, I mean, I've had issues with him when it comes to, not being. I wish he were more forthright when it comes to challenging the U.S. war machine, and I think also challenging
Uh,
the U.S. war machine would also help pay for a lot of the social programs he's proposing. But yeah, I mean, look, Medicare for all, it's a great idea. We all need it. I want it. Higher minimum wage. I mean, especially I live in California, right? The It's true. The rent is way too goddamn high. It's way too fucking high.
it's way too
Most
high
most
in
people
Maine too.
It's way too high actually
Can't stay
everywhere,
here.
and a higher minimum wage would make sense. A Green New Deal, especially with the reality of climate change and also this coronavirus that's going around, which it seems to be linked to climate change in terms of like how far it's spreading. That makes sense. So it's like he's proposing policies that, like, look, you don't, that makes sense. There really isn't much of a really compelling argument in my opinion against raising the minimum wage, having single payer health care, having a Green New Deal.
Oh no, Elizabeth
It,
Warren and Joe Biden will do all of those things.
yeah,
They know how to do it. I don't know how they're going to do it, because they'll because like it's still they're still the same fucking Senate, but they know, they understand something about politics that Bernie Sanders just doesn't understand. Apparently, I don't
well,
know what that is. They never tell me what that is, but they just know.
yeah. Well, here's the thing: is like, I mean, it's particularly like a lot of people who I want to make a response to, not really just warn people, but a lot of people who are like, well, Bernie Sanders does not have a plan, blah 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 blah, like all that kind of
That's
stuff. Like,
such
how is he gonna?
crap.
It's bullshit. And here's why I think it's bullshit: is because again, Bernie Sanders has a base. The Republicans understand this better than the Democrats. The
Yeah.
Republican Party is able to pass an agenda because they have a base. It's a horrible base. It's a racist base, but they have a base that they're accountable to. And so
Mhm.
that base provides political muscle that helps them get their legislation passed. The Democrats need the same thing. You need a base that represents you. It's
Yeah.
just basic politics 101. If you're a political party and you want to pass legislation, your base is your political muscle to get things through. You're not going to get things through by meeting Mitch McConnell halfway. That's not
Yeah.
that's not how it works. Because you're going to
Yeah.
get, usually you're going to, at best you're going to get the most watered down version of a progressive policy that you're going to get, which isn't going to
No,
do
he's
as
not.
much as it
He's
should.
not. He's those Republicans are in total fucking mode. They're not going.
Yeah,
They have no
yeah.
incentive to work with anyone. The
No,
the
they won't.
whole that whole idea of bipartisan compromise is based on a previous reality where there basically when white supremacist patriarchy was so completely entrenched in national politics that it really was just like a gentleman's club and it was like, yeah, we'll just drink a bunch of whiskey and hammer this shit out, right? That's not like what politics is now. So,
And yeah, and
and
and you need also muscle to defeat the modern Republican Party is just white racism without a mask on, right? Because
yeah,
since Nixon's Southern strategy, the Democratic Party the Republican Party, they used to be a Democratic Party, but now they're in the Republican Party. But like that former slaveholding class of the Democrats switched the Republicans during Nixon's Southern strategy in 1968. So since then, the Republican Party has always been basically a safe haven for racists and bigots. Donald Trump is just that without the mask anymore. Because
yeah,
previously they kind of had to hide their bigotry, and this is going back to Lee Atwater, which is basically okay, don't say the N word, just say we're opposed to busing. We're opposed to all these policies that hurt black people and people of color. Now Trump is just like, hey, you know what? Fuck Mexicans. We don't want them anymore. So he's saying the quiet racist part out loud. And that's why he won, because he appealed to, again, what was always part of the Republican base, which is overt white nationalism and overt white racism. So the way to defeat
yeah.
that is having a strong
It's
multiracial working class
it.
base to defeat it.
You know,
That's how you fit.
and what doesn't defeat it is people with weird obsessions for 25-page white papers that nobody will read but are going to account for every single dime or whatever. Like what people have to understand is that the whole how are you going to pay for it? Well, first of all, governments aren't households. This is like a basic part of macroeconomics. You don't have to account for like it's not like balancing a checkbook.
And governments can print money too.
Yes,
Households can't.
yes, yes. There's a lot of difference, but also like it's that whole thing is just designed to get people off message. Anytime someone asks a question, anytime you're like, why are they asking this dumb question? It's just to get Bernie Sanders off message, so he talks about dumb shit instead of the shit he's going to talk about. So trying to penny pinch and account for every single dime, the Medicare for All plan is just that's all it's doing. Nobody actually knows or cares. Even the people who like have graduate degrees in health policy, like all 2000 of them, like they don't even they like understand that like that's not the most important thing right now. um so
Yeah.
the Warren people who are just like, I love plans and I love, you know if they're able to like argue that we're basically on the same side, they just love spreadsheets or whatever, but like it really is going to like, do you really love spreadsheets more than like actually enacting change? I mean, like,
Spreadsheets are boring, by the way. So
yes, and most regular people don't read spreadsheets. This is the thing that the Warren people who got great grades and are and all that shit, like regular people don't have time, and like they don't have the mental energy to focus on that shit. And they just need like someone who can coherently and believably convince them that they are on their side. And Elizabeth Warren doesn't do that because she's not. Sometimes I feel you know like, oh, okay, yeah, she has the right idea about things, but then it's just like it just doesn't, the classic sort of question of like, does Elizabeth Warren care about people like me and my coworkers? I just I can't, answer yes. I just can't. Like there's no feeling
yeah.
there.
Well, I think, and just to wrap this up and getting onto Sankara, but I'll just add this one point that one thing I've been noticing is I think there is like a real class divide among so-called
Yes.
progressives in America, and I've been noticing that with like someone pointed this out. Two of my friends who are Muslim pointed this out. They said amongst the Muslim community in the U.S., they said a lot of the Muslims who support Warren tend to be wealthier and more upper class, whereas the working class Muslims tend to go for Sanders. And I
Yeah,
kind of noticed that amongst the black community in America is that like a lot of regular kind of working class black folks, I think, in my opinion, they're either going to swing for Sanders or Biden. And but the ones who are more like professional managerial class, a lot of them tend to go for Warren. And I think one sort of thing I've noticed, just in terms of the commentary and shit like that, when it comes to this election, is um, I think Warren again. She speaks to her solutions is like working within capitalism as much as possible, where Bernie Sanders is like basically working as much outside of capitalism as much as possible. But one thing I've noticed is that like yeah, a lot of professional class, professional managerial class, upper middle class people tend to like Warren. And the sense I get, and this is even talking just friends of mine who know Warren supporters, and even people I
yeah.
know who are
Too
Warren
many, too
supporters.
too many people we went to school with, honestly.
Right? Yeah. Um, a lot of them, I think, like they're in again professional managerial class jobs. They're not rich, but they're also not poor, and they're usually not around working class people on a very regular basis. And so their lives, for the most part, I'm not saying they're perfect, but like their
Yeah,
lives are kind of fine. It's okay.
it's
So it's
it's
like, yeah,
not.
like they'll settle.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's not a thing. This isn't about their direct future. Like even like Trump makes them
right,
feel bad, but it isn't like they don't understand how they're going to live the next 4 years without Bernie Sanders being president. And I am not
right.
kidding when I'm saying that there are a large amount of people who think that way. Um,
Yeah.
and that's more important than whatever weird mean tweets people get sent to you. But Adam, are you saying that perhaps class concerns are people consider them over racial concerns?
Actually, Peter, what I'm saying is that, and this is a segue into the next topic of our podcast is Sankara. That actually, did you know that you can have a robust critique of white supremacy and European colonization and still have a critique of capitalism and favor socialism?
I
Oh my God!
I don't
Whoa!
believe you. That sounds like some white trust fund Bernie bro put you up to this.
You know who's a total white trust fund Bernie bro? Thomas Sankara. Like he's from Africa, okay?
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. This whole Bernie bro shit is just oh god. Anyway, on to Thomas Sankara. To
Yes.
the man who we named our podcast over, Thomas
Yes.
Sankara.
Yes. Word up, white lefties. We're the only ones who can claim him. You can't claim him anymore.
Yes,
Sorry.
yeah,
I love you
exactly.
guys,
Yep.
but you can't claim him anymore. Uh,
So Thomas Sankara, he was born December 21st, 1949. He died. Well, he was assassinated by a friend of his on October 15th, 1987. He was a revolutionary from Burkina Faso, which was like much of West Africa was colonized by France, and during the time of French colonization, was referred to as Upper Volta and the Republic of Upper Volta. Burkina Faso, when
yeah.
Thomas Sankara became president, means land of upright men.
He
He was
changed the
president.
name to Burkina Faso. It was
Yep.
Upright Volta. It was Upright Volta. Um, it
Sounds like a
was
band name.
Yeah, yeah. Mars Volta is cool. Upper Volta
Yeah.
when he took over, he was the one who changed it. In the classic sort of sense of like getting rid of the colonial name, um, and
Yeah.
getting rid of the neo-colonial system that accompanied it. And that's basically he was someone who um, he grew up in pretty poor family. But he was very smart, and he, you know, in a lot of poor countries, the military is the only way you can advance yourself.
Yeah.
come from humble backgrounds. So he joined the military and did enough well in school to get sent to a military academy in Madagascar
Hmm.
in 1970. And what was going on in Madagascar in 1970 in the early 70s?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think Thomas Sankara, I think his family, I think his upbringing was probably somewhat middle class, but I think like being middle class in Burkina Faso at the time may be different than
Yeah.
middle class in America. But so yeah, like he began basic military training in 1966. So he was like I think he was around like 16, 17 around that time. And he went to Madagascar for officer training. And this was the at that time it was under the government of Philibert Tsiranana, and Madagascar had basically won its independence from France in the early '60s, but Tsiranana was sort of like I think one of those sort of neo-colonial politicians who was a holdover from the former European colonizers. And so there were popular student and farmer uprisings against the government of Suriname at the time in the early 70s. So Sankara is, a young guy going through office training in Madagascar and witnessing these popular uprisings against this essentially this neo-colonial government. And it was around that time he was reading Karl Marx and Lenin. So he was getting real political
Yeah.
consciousness at the time he was getting military training. Then he
Yes.
returned to
Yeah.
what was then still called Upper Volta in 1972.
Yeah. I want to say that, yeah, in the late 60s, early 70s, like, every, like, especially in a lot of the global south, it was like people were just like, everyone was learning about communism, and not weird Cold War shit, like the actual shit. They either would, like, you could go, a lot of people went to the Soviet Union for, free university education. And, people like Ho Chi Minh and, lots of people from Africa as well, got, learned, like, were trained in guerrilla warfare. A lot of the ANC, African National Congress, that was fighting the apartheid regime, were trained in the Soviet Union. Um, and so, yeah, it makes perfect sense that, like, just being in a military academy in the early 70s, he would be exposed to these ideas. And I think he was even exposed to them earlier, but there he got to see them in action, and it clearly had an effect on him. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so after his military training in 1972, he returned to what was then still called Upper Volta, but now it's called Burkina Faso. And there was a border war between Burkina Faso and Mali, and that's where he earned his fame being a soldier during that war for his heroic performance. And so he became more politicized, and he was a popular figure in the capital of Ouagadougou. That's the capital of Burkina Faso. That's the way I know how to pronounce it. There could be other pronunciations, but he was also a musician. He was a pretty decent guitarist. He
oh
played in a band.
man, he
So this
he
guy
he
was
and
like
Blaze were in a
cool.
band together. Oh man,
Oh,
that's a
uh,
fucking movie to be made.
yeah.
I can't
And
believe
so
that.
yeah, and he met Blaise Compaore in commando training. I think it was around the time he was doing commando training somewhere in like Morocco. And so anyway, he works his way up through the military government, and he becomes president of Burkina Faso in uh, basically a non-violent coup d'état in 1983. Um, and yeah, and one thing that really sticks out to me in learning more about Sankara is, and I think what's really interesting, the more I learn about like African history and politics, and I'm still learning more, so
Yeah,
I don't know everything, but what I find
we definitely don't know
fascinating,
everything.
right? Yeah, so we're still learning as well, but what's fascinating about Sankara, and I think particularly at that time is, after the independence movements, the national independence movements in these African countries, there's still self rule in terms of the governments, but there's still like a sort of holdover class from the colonial era that still want to have hold on power, and there's still like a segment of elites in African continents who still want to
Yeah.
maintain a friendly relationship with their former colonial powers, whereas Sankara was like,
Yeah.
"Fuck all that."
Yeah.
He
Neo
pissed off a lot of people because
Yeah, neo-colonialism. Kwame Nkrumah, the leader of Ghana in the late '60s, he wrote a lot about it. If you want to understand, sort of basically how you know African states were granted formal independence, but the colonial relationships, that made colonialism profitable for European countries, especially France. Um, they have a whole thing called France Afrique, which is basically like the neo-colonial relationship France has with its former colonies,
yeah.
including Burkina Faso.
Hmm. There's
That's a key
also
thing.
yeah, and also ever since this is one thing to kind of keep in mind too. This is more contemporary when it comes to uh, understanding Africa during um, the 2011 U.S. NATO U.S./NATO military intervention in Libya. There is a spillover effect it had in the rest of Africa, and a lot, particularly France. I remember the time they were very giddy about being part of the coalition to bomb Libya and get rid of
Yeah. Oh
Gaddafi.
yeah, they rolled
And
into
there were
Mali. They were so happy about it.
yeah, yeah. So and also like when it comes to drone strikes, there's a drone base in Niger in Africa, and I'm sure some of you guys remember there was a ambush against U.S. soldiers in Niger not too long ago. And so there's a lot of like covert and secret operations going on because the U.S. is still looking at because if you look at Burkina Faso on a map, there's Burkina Faso, there's Mali, there's countries like Niger and Chad that are pretty much like right on the edge of the Sahara, and a lot of those countries are Muslim, and so the U.S. is viewing Africa as like another front in the war on terror, and so there are some militant
Which
groups.
is a fun way of saying running guns to separatist militias to
Yeah,
further, their own geopolitical goals. Who, whatever they are, who even know? It was like, what the hell are we doing in Niger, right?
yeah, yeah. There's a lot of it's like these are like drone bases. A lot of them are mostly for surveillance and to usually help coordinate whatever operations are going on the ground. And a lot of times, U.S. soldiers are training the militaries of these countries, but there's a lot more um, going on there, and also there are protests in Mali. I think still going on, but they're going on recently against French military bases in Mali. So there's still this. You can still see this neo-colonial relationship between the United States and Western Europe with Africa. And Sankara, I think, is a very fascinating and inspiring figure to look at, particularly in the context of that history, because he was just basically a giant middle finger to that
Yeah.
relationship. So he was very much about not relying on foreign aid. He was very much about self sufficiency for
Yeah,
Burkina
yeah.
Faso.
Buy local. He was like the original buy local guy.
Right,
Um,
and not in like a hipster semi-capitalist way. He was very socialist, communist. Like he was, and yeah, he was basically just said "f you" to foreign aid. Was very anti-imperialist. He
yeah,
regularly called out Europe's imperial relationship with Africa. He was also a feminist as well.
yeah. This is
He
a really big
believed
thing.
strong. So he strongly believed in the role that women have to play in the revolution, and so he banned forced marriages. He also banned genital mutilation. He also, I think, he had one law where he allowed women to take a break from shopping and made the men go shopping,
Oh
and as
yeah,
a result of
it was on International Women's Day,
yeah,
which initially was International Working Women's Day, and they took that out to now it's like it's gotten very neoliberal, but it was very much a socialist holiday when it was first conceived.
Here's what Thomas Sankara said about women's rights. He said, "The revolution and women's liberation go together. We do not talk of women's emancipation as an act of charity or because of a surge of human compassion. It is a basic necessity for the triumph of the revolution. Women hold up the other half of the sky." Um, yeah, he also promoted contraception, and so like he was very ardent socialist, was all about empowering Burkina Faso, and was a feminist, and so he saw the role of women as crucial in terms of building up Burkina Faso, building up the nation, building up the revolution, and
Yeah.
he also made severe cuts to the salaries of government employees, because previously they were like a lot of government employees, officials at the time, were driving nice cars, had fat salaries. So he cut their salaries by a lot. I forgot the percentage, but it was significant.
Yeah.
He also cut his own salary, forced them to drive. They had to switch from the old Mercedes Benz to like these sort of just regular janky cars.
Were they
So they had to
Pugos?
live
I was trying to
humbly.
figure that out.
I think so. I think they're Pugos. I'm not sure. Maybe someone else can look up the model of the
Yeah.
car. It was one of those old, like, kind of, it seemed like
Yeah.
a European 1980s model car. He himself lived very humbly, so he practiced what he preached in terms of his socialist values, and a lot of times, like, socialism here in the West particularly in the United States, is always seen like, oh, it's just only white dude bros care about socialism. Only white dude bros
Yeah.
care about capitalism. But Sankara is like, to me, you could he's the one who he understood great. I'm gonna say intersection, like intersectionality, like
Intersectionality is a
telling.
good word. It's not a bad word.
Yes, it's not a bad. It's just been watered down so
Yeah.
so much that I'm conscious about how I use it. But he implemented socialism within the context of uplifting the Burkina Faso nation, and unfortunately, he met a very tragic end. Like I was saying earlier, he pissed off a lot of African elites who still wanted to have a capitalist relationship with European capitalist countries. So his friend, Blaise Compaore, there was basically, yeah, there's a coup, and he was assassinated in a
Yeah.
coup in October 15th, 1987. And the troops were led by his friend, Blaise Compaore. Um, it's just something. Wait, I want to read the quote that Sankara said before he died. But it was just a week before Sankara's assassination. He said, "While revolutionaries as individuals can be murdered, you cannot kill ideas." And he was assassinated by his.
He
Yeah,
preceded V for Vendetta by 20 years.
yeah.
Um,
And so Blaise Compaore, he he assassinated. I don't know if he was the one who pulled the trigger, but he was part of the coup
um,
that killed
yeah, he
Sankara.
might have. I should have
Yeah,
watched the documentary again right beforehand.
yeah,
But I do want to sort of get into some of the later parts. So like he was only in power for 4 years, and like
yeah,
in those 4 years, right, he like massively increased the grain output. You know, engaged in these sort of very. I mean, they were a lot of the tactics and stuff he was doing was like straight from the Soviet Union, from like the Russian Revolution. I mean, some. Well, he there were some. We'll get to sort of. I don't know. I wouldn't say criticisms, but it got by the end. It was getting to be a complicated situation, but he basically like built utilized pure people power to build like 100 kilometers of railroads, um, and he was leading. He was trying to organize, basically get like the entire African organization of African unity, basically like most of the continent to do a debt strike um, on the with the World Bank, because the World Bank and IMF, International Monetary Fund, were basically these institutions set up to like give out loans for development in global South countries, but they usually came with these terrible restrictions. And yeah, and basically you'd either end up being unable to pay it, or you'd have to impose all these very pro-market measures, sell off all of your like state-owned assets and stuff. But I guess some of the more controversial things that he engaged in, which were part of This is like it's important to not necessarily purely romanticize like what a revolutionary movement is, because it is like you're throwing out an old order and instituting a new one, and that is not a clean process. So part of the thing he introduced was revolutionary tribunals, and this is like this is a thing. He didn't invent this concept in other, in China and in Russia and in other sort of revolutionary situations. It's basically like the idea is that, in the new revolution, like your shitty boss and the landlord that has, treated you like shit, and all the corrupt like officials, that exist in your area beforehand, now, like, you get to put them on trial and enact some sort of justice. But, if it isn't sort of like a rigorously overseen process, then, what can happen is that, like, basically people have, like, old scores, old feuds that they settle, and they utilize, this new revolutionary situation to, settle the scores. Hold on a second.
Hey everyone, Adam here. Peter and I, we had some technical difficulties with the podcast software on our end. So the previous hour was recorded fine, but then it stopped in the middle. So I had to do some kind of cutting and pasting and syncing with the audio. So yeah, around this end we got cut off, and then we had to just redo the take. So the next 10-15 minutes of this podcast is fine. So anyway, just wanted to make a note of that, because as you can tell on the podcast, there's a weird sort of glitch that happened. So anyway, that was the reason why. But don't worry, the next part of this podcast toward the end, everything else is fine. So anyway, enjoy.
Yeah. All right. So last time around. So one of the things Thomas Sankara did was institute people's revolutionary tribunals, and this is not like a concept he invented. This happens pretty frequently in revolutionary situations. But it's basically like, imagine post-revolution, like all the terrible like bosses and like corrupt officials and landlords and shit that everyone hates. You get to put them on trial for all the terrible things that they've done. And this is a good thing. Like, let's be clear, this is a good thing, but it can be, like any sort of judicial process, it has to be rigorously overseen. And also, like, Amnesty International, freaking imperialist stooges, criticized, a lot of like sort of liberal foundations criticized this for not adhering to, the traditional sort of jurisprudence, right, innocent till proven guilty, right to a lawyer and stuff. And I mean, some people agree with it, but it's also true that like a lot of those norms are like about the bourgeoisie defending its property. But the other thing is like, another important part, another thing that happens in revolutions is like sort of creating popular militias, arming the people to be able to defend the revolution if it gets invaded. But, you know, if that's, it's like if you organize a bunch of military, paramilitary militias, but they're not, rigorously overseen, then, out of control behavior can happen. And there were instances of that, though. Sankara definitely, took steps to, address that. And I guess the other big thing is that, there were, in the middle of the literacy program, there basically weren't like independent unions, which created a problem with like the teachers. And there was a teacher strike in 1987, and he tried to sort of create like a revolutionary teachers program that didn't have the great. It didn't do well. So by 1987, he was getting a little bit unpopular at home, but that really wasn't what did him in. Honestly, what did him in was the elections in France, because Mitterrand was the previous prime minister. He was more of like a moderate liberal, and he was out, and Jacques Chirac, who was a right wing conservative, was in, and he basically moved pretty quickly to end this situation. But if he hadn't, right, then they would have just made Thomas Sankara. If Thomas Sankara hadn't basically died as a martyr, then they would have just made him another authoritarian African dictator, and they would have made him they would have made him out to be like a really bad guy. So a lot of times, like, it's something to think about when you're thinking about his legacy. But alongside, I guess, like, some of his failings, he really did represent a vision of hope for the entire continent.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, so I think we were talking about the cars. So yeah, so the government had a fleet of Mercedes, and the model he switched to was a Renault 5. It's a Renault 5. That was the cheapest car sold in Burkina Faso at the time. So those are the cars that the government officials and ministers had to drive. He reduced the salaries of public service, including his own, and his own salary as president was $450 a month. He limited his possessions to a car, 4 bikes, 3 guitars, a refrigerator, and a broken freezer. He also refused to use air conditioning in his office because he said that luxury was not available to most people in Burkina Faso. And he also redistributed land from feudal landlords to the peasants, which helped make the country food self-sufficient. So, I mean, yeah, like a lot of, like any ruler of any country, I mean, they're gonna be criticisms and measures they do where they overstep their bounds, but you also have to balance. I mean, I'm just speaking in terms of like just assessing a leader, because like, look, you can look at plenty of our presidents, right? Like, I mean, yeah, there's some good things. I mean, look, there's some good things that FDR did, but hey, he also oversaw Japanese internment, right?
Yeah.
So
I also want to say it's not just like, oh, he did some good things and he did some bad things. Both, no revolution happens in a vacuum, and it never happens under ideal conditions. So, you have to take, like, I mean, a lot of state infrastructures in African countries, are underdeveloped. And so, you really do have to work with what you've got. And so, that can go awry, but it isn't like, but these are parts of the process. It's not like there are some less, hope and wonderful, inspiring parts of the process. You know, it's not it's you know it's not like people. I don't like to talk about. I don't like to use the R word so much right now because I think people need to be very clear about what that process entails if they want to go around calling for it.
Right. And yeah, I'll
By R word, I
wrap
mean
up.
revolution, but I also don't use the other one.
So Blaise Compaoré, he was
Genghis
president
Khan.
of Burkina Faso. So he basically assassinated, or at least played a role in assassinating Sankara in 1987, and he basically undid a lot of the reforms that were implemented by Sankara from 83 to 87. And Blaise Compaoré was president of Burkina Faso from 1987 to 2014. So he was in office for 27 years, and there was an uprising in 2014 that ousted him, and he had to. He was ousted on. He resigned from as president on Halloween, October 31st, 2014, and he fled to Ivory Coast. And yeah, and so he was also he played a role in the Sierra Leone Civil War, and he introduced Charles Taylor to um, Muammar Gaddafi. He also helped Charles Taylor in the Sierra Leone War. So like, he had Campari had a pretty not so
Yeah,
pleasant record.
yeah.
I'm putting that very
Yeah,
very very
he
mildly.
also like completely changed course and basically did all the neoliberal IMF, shit France and everyone else wanted him to do.
Yeah. And so to wrap this up, you know, given not just this election, but the things that are going on in the world, from the endless U.S. wars to the very serious climate crisis in the world, um, the rise of fascism in the West, not just in the United States, but in Europe and throughout Western countries, and even also in India too, with Modi in power as well.
Mm.
So, all the stuff that's going on, and I think that there's a real collapse of legitimacy in the neoliberal world order, and I think there's this time is ripe for new, fresh, radical political thinking, because I think as we began this episode by talking about the elections, it's very very clear that
Yeah.
the two party system is, first of all, the Republican Party, they just want total white nationalism and fascism at this point, whereas the Democrats, they would rather have 4 years of Trump than social democracy. So the Democrats don't want to
Yeah.
have any kind of even mild progressive reform. So at this point, especially with the Sanders base, it's this, like, if you don't have a Democratic a party in the U.S. that represents that very real aspiration for progressive, populist, social democratic policies, it's got that energy has to go somewhere. So I think now's the time to have real radical thinking and ideas in politics, and there needs to be like a new kind of politics, and sort of the, I guess, raison d'etre of this show, or his podcast, and the reason why we're doing this is like, both Peter and I sort of see ourselves as at least trying to stand in the tradition of people like Sankara and other black African socialist
And
revolutionaries and thinkers, and trying to learn from that stuff and implement them and see what we can learn today.
yeah, and internationalism is, I think, a big key. That was a big
Yes,
part of it.
yes.
But yeah, when I watched, the documentary, preparing for, this stuff to kind of get me back up to speed, it was like, he really represented like this kind of new, it was just a new over. I mean, he did plenty of good things, but it's also just like he represented a vision, a possibility, um, of a future and of a world that just didn't have to be, just unnecessary. I feel like unnecessarily exploitative and just mean and cruel, and like people, the possibility that people could come together and determine their own destiny to live decent lives. If there's anything that I think we're doing, that would ever come close to that, it's, trying to carry on, trying to represent that, and also, thinking about how, right, one election in France determined his fate, basically. It's important to remember when you're in the imperial core, as we are, that, like, our decisions, what goes on here has effects worldwide.
Yeah, and with that, we'll end this podcast. In this episode.
Yes. No, we're done. 2 episodes.
We're not quitting
out.
We're not quitting this podcast
We'll
game.
never shut up.
We are just getting started. So again, follow us at Sankara Hours on Twitter. Please subscribe, support us, spread, tell people about this podcast. And like I said, now is a time for really radical thinking in politics, because the current order as it exists globally is not up to speed.
It's not, it's not doing it.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned that New York Times article, because I think, the Democratic Party establishment, they're just saying the quiet part out loud now, that they would rather have 4 years of neo-fascism under Trump rather than implementing any kind of mild social democratic reform. So there has to be another way to channel that energy and at least chart a new vision for what the world could look like. And we're not the only ones doing it. There are plenty of other people who are fighting for freedom and justice, and basically just to create a better world for all of humanity. So we definitely stand in solidarity with that. And that's it. That's all I got to say. You have anything else to say, Peter?
It's like 3 o'clock now, but I might listen to the new G Herbo album that just came out.
Nice.
I'm trying to keep up on SoundCloud rap, but it's hard.
You're probably doing a better job than I am.
I have coworkers that are like a decade younger than me, so.
Oh shit. Okay. Yeah. All right. So that's it for this podcast.
Yeah. Peace.
All right. Peace.
Thomas Sankara, capitaine Sankara, ce sont tes bras morts qui t'engagent. Sankara, Thomas Sankara, capitaine Sankara, ce sont tes bras morts qui t'engagent. Un coup d'état entraîne toujours d'autres coups d'état. Et les frères d'armes, tôt ou tard, deviennent ennemis. Et ça, je vous l'avais déjà dit. Le pouvoir se prend par les urnes et non par les armes. Et non par les armes. Sankara, Thomas Sankara, capitaine Sankara, ce sont tes bras morts qui t'ont Une trahison entraîne toujours une autre trahison. Il n'y a pas de saison. Et là, j'ai raison. Le pouvoir se prend par les urnes.
Et ça, je vous l'avais déjà dit.
Et non par les armes.
Et non par les armes. Que les salles se lavent en famille, mais pas dans le sang.
Ouh là 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 là. De vengeance en vengeance, l'Afrique a tombé dans la déchéance. Vouloir venger Sankara, c'est perpétuer la bêtise. La bêtise politique, antidémocratique. Soif de pouvoir, c'est la boulimie du pouvoir, c'est la gourmandise du pouvoir.